Welcome back to the Daily Debate. Next up, the EU referendum. Britain voted by the closest of margins to leave the EU earlier this year, but many of the claims and promises made by both sides during their campaigns have been found to be questionable at best. So, is it time to hold a second EU referendum? I'm going to put that over to my panel. Emily, over to you.
Honestly, I really don't think that we should be holding a second EU referendum. The public have spoken. They have decided that we want to leave. The cost of a referendum is exponential. It would be better to put money from a second referendum towards working out the best deal now that we are leaving. If we choose to do a second referendum and on the off chance decide to remain in it, it has a risk of then in 10 or 20 years wanting to do the entire process all over again. Brexit is Brexit. We have decided this and we must stay with that decision.
Wasn't the EU referendum won on lies, though?
I would argue that the EU referendum was not fully won on lies. If you look at what the public thought, the public made a decision based on what they truly believed. Honestly, I don't think that the campaigns from Vote Leave or Britain Stronger in Europe were strong enough to have that much of an impact and affected the entire referendum. The public used their own opinions, their own media sources, and not everything that was said by the campaigns was a lie.
Thank you very much indeed. Alastair, time for EU Ref Take 2?
I wish. Unfortunately, I don't think it's possible because the way the exit deal from the European Union will be negotiated requires the triggering of Article 50, and there's no way from going back from that.
But we haven't triggered Article 50 yet.
Not yet, but my idea, the basis of a referendum for me would be that the government works out exactly what would happen when we were to vote to leave, and then we'd vote based on that, rather than the Pinterest mood board of ideas that were presented by the Leave campaign. So that would be the only condition in which I'd support a second referendum, and it's impossible.
Finn, do you support a second ref?
I completely oppose it. Well, for the democratic process, I believe it would be incredibly damaging to democracy.
Anti-democratic?
Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah. I believe it's anti-democratic. Democratic. A second referendum would run the risk of alienating a significant proportion of the population. The turnout was very high. It was around 74%, I believe, 60 million people. And that was higher than the general election, which was 66%. This shows that people are significantly more concerned with the EU because the people that voted Leave were the ones that had been downtrodden by globalisation, deregulation, and the EU in general. They had not seen the benefits. And I believe that if we were to step back on this and hold a second referendum, this would run the risk of deterring people from participating in a democratic process anymore.
What sort of backlash do you think the democratic process or whichever party happened to be in charge would face were there to be a second EU referendum?
Well, this is the problem with the Conservatives. May at the moment is stuck between a rock and a hard place. It's either open border immigration, which won't happen, as David Davis said, and access to the free market. And I believe that if she compromised on really either, she would lose a significant amount of support. I don't think enough for her to lose, but it'll definitely damage the amount of votes she gets.
Tara, what's your take?
I think that we shouldn't have a second referendum and that the reasons that we're being given are kind of twofold. So we're either being told that the public made the wrong decision, essentially, that we should do it again in an attempt to get that Remain vote and carry on as we are, in which case you're making the assumption that the public were somehow unable to make that decision. Either they were unable to discern the lies of the Leave campaign or they didn't know enough about the full impacts of what that would be, in which case surely the best course of action is not a second referendum, but to give the issue over to Parliament, who do have that knowledge, that ability to discern the lies. The second suggestion has been the referendum on terms, which Alastair said he'd support. I think that's equally, even if we could get some kind of deal struck where we could have the referendum based on what Article 50 looks like, Alastair thinks that's possible, but even if that did happen, who's going to vote for those terms? People who don't like Theresa May aren't going to vote for those terms. People who are angry with the Conservatives aren't going to vote for those terms. People who wanted to remain aren't going to vote for those terms. People who are staunch UKIP supporters who don't think we're going far enough aren't going to vote for those terms. If you have a referendum based on terms, you're never going to get something through, even if it is the best possible deal. So I think now we've decided we're going to Brexit, we have to leave it up to Parliament to decide exactly what that looks like.
4.1 million names have been associated with, have signed an e-petition asking for a second referendum. It's a substantial number of the voting population, let's face it. Should protestations like these be ignored? Or at what point does this number reach a tipping point where it needs to be taken seriously? Alastair?
I'd imagine around the mark that voted Leave, which was about 17 million people.
Mm-hmm.
If I could just bring Tara up on the point that she made, that's okay.
Yes, please do.
The idea that the Vote Leave's case collapses when you bring it into the scape of reality is probably a sign that something is wrong and we should do something about that. The idea that no one would vote for the terms of Brexit because they do not like the terms surely implies that the way the referendum ran did not give a proper exercise of democracy. If the public would not vote for the real terms, why should we allow the result, which was voted on theoretical fancy terms, to stand?
I'm just going to hold you there because I've got another question. We'll give you a chance to come back in a moment as well. If during the campaign for both sides in the lead up to the EU referendum, some of the claims, some of the promises were found to be lies, what do you think should be the ramifications of that? If people have lied as part of a democratic process on either side, surely they should be held to task.
I doubt that there would be much we could do physically or through the process, but I imagine that their political careers would see damage in the future. For example, Lib Dems capitulating on their tuition freeze promise. We can see how that's affected them electorally. So I would hope that in future the lessons would be learned that the electorate doesn't appreciate being misled. And
yeah. So you think that it would be damaging for political careers where they found to have been making fake promises?
Well, it's been interesting to see the Vote Leave figures leading figures try to distance themselves from the 350 million for the NHS.
Boris Johnson, for example, now holds a very senior position in office, despite those numbers being very widely ridiculed.
Exactly, and people like Dominic Cummings, who have produced leaflets to deliberately mock up NHS-style things, even though he's more behind the scenes, I would hope that there would be ramifications electorally and really make a stand. I was quite impressed to see Michael Gove removed from the cabinet. I thought that was a good move. And
I'm sure a lot of people agreed with you.
Some of the other leading figures who were responsible for some of the wrongdoing. I imagine Boris Johnson was more of a move of appeasement rather than one of skill within internal Conservative Party politics.
Alastair, thank you very much. Panel, thank you very much indeed. Time to hear from our studio audience, who no doubt have been champing at the bit over the last few minutes. Who are we going to hear from first of all? Aisha, your point, please.
I was strongly in favour of the Remain campaign, but I think given a democratic country and the really high turnout, 74%, the country should just accept democracy, and the people have spoken. It'd be ridiculous to get them to do it all over again, and it's not worth the cost.
The cost is a very important point. So,
Yeah.
so you believe, you want to uphold the democratic principles. We may not all agree with the outcome, and of course it was a very close result, but the fact that that was the outcome, and that is what should stand, according to you, Aisha.
I think the turnout was really high, that you can't ignore the turnout if it was higher than the general election. I think the people have spoken, and there's a significant majority of the population too.
Why do you think the turnout was so high in comparison to the general election, as we heard from our panel there? Were people just more engaged because it was something they felt directly affected them?
I think it's an issue that affects us all, whether it be directly or indirectly. And with the general election, because it's obviously held so frequently, people tend to lose focus, interest, and aren't educated enough. But with an issue that affects you so closely, I think everyone wanted to just voice their opinions, which clearly they have done, so it should be respected.
Thank you very much, Aisha. Sophie, quickly a point from you.
I actually do believe there should be a second referendum, purely because the promises made from the Brexit campaign haven't exactly been fulfilled. For example, the 350 million per week for NHS, that hasn't gone through, so why should we continue with Brexit when promises aren't being fulfilled? Will they ever be fulfilled? So maybe we should have a second referendum.
Well, of course, we don't know if that will ever be fulfilled because we haven't officially Brexited yet. Only time will tell. Audience, thank you very much indeed. Panel, thank you very much once again. We'll be back just after the break. Don't go away.